У нас выступит Ян Стоксет. Коллеги, у нас есть регламент. Напоминаю, что это 10 минут на выступление само, а затем уже вопросы будут. Будем обсуждать доклады. Ян, прошу вас, включайте звук. Будем рады вас выслушать.
Ну, спасибо вам за приглашение. К сожалению, мой уровень русского языка не так хорошо, чтобы прочитать лекцию на русском языке, поэтому мне надо пользоваться английский язык. Но я знаю, что вы хорошо владеете английский язык. Поэтому сейчас на английском. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's an interesting project. My background is that I've been a teacher in the gymnasium in Norway for many years, and I lived in the Arctic region of Norway for some years. Finnmark, not far away from Kirkenes. I've been to Spitsbergen a few times, visited Pyramiden, Barentsburg, and I'm also interested in the political sides of the development of Arctic, and it's a very interesting and rich region, and of course it includes also a lot of politics. And I will give you a short historical background about Fritьof Nansen. Fritьof Nansen is one of the great heroes of Norway, but sorry to say, he is not so very actual, or he's not making the headlines these days. And there are different reasons for that, but I'll leave that alone. But let's turn to his influence on the science of Arctic, because he was the first human being who was spent a lot of time in these regions. And he was born in 1861, at a time when we didn't have any telephone, we didn't have the motors. It was all sailing ships. It was communication through your mouth, and so the possibility of aid when you travel in Arctic was very limited, or it was actually absent. As I said, he was born in 1861, and his first experience with the Arctic region was that he participated on a sailing ship that was hunting seals, bears, and whales in the Arctic when he was around 27 years old. And this sparked light in him, and he wanted to follow this path. He was an outstanding athlete. He was in good shape. He was interested in science, studied at Bergen, zoology at Bergen, and he was driven towards the Arctic for many different reasons. He was the first, or his first drive, so to speak, was to cross Greenland. Greenland was an unknown continent at the time. One didn't know very much about the region. It was an idea that maybe there was no ice in the middle of Greenland. No one had been there because there were no airplanes and satellites, of course. So it was unknown. A Swedish explorer, I forgot his name, was the first to set foot on the east coast of Greenland, but he didn't manage to go very far. So Fritьof Nansen, he formed an expedition. I think there were six men, and he sailed to the east coast of Greenland and managed to cross without no dogs at the time, sledges. He managed to cross the ice in, I think, around two months. Started in August, I think it was 1888, and he reached the other side after 2 months. It was a very hard trip, and no one had done it before. The altitude, the height of the mountains that they crossed were around 1,700 meters tall, and of course it was ice all over there. One didn't exactly know how high the ice was, but as you know and we know now, it's approximately some places around 3 kilometers of ice. So it's an enormous amount of ice or energy or cooling system that is stored on Greenland. But nevertheless, he managed to cross this this continent, and when he arrived at Good Hope, after 2 months, the last ship had sailed, so he had to spend the winter there. So he had to stay there for 1 year, and that is something new scientists can learn from. The persistence, the strongness, the strength that these first explorers had. They didn't stop when they encountered problems. They just carried on. And his slogan was forward, because there was no way back. If he ran into trouble when crossing the Greenland, there was no way to return, or he could return, but there were no ship waiting for him, of course. So that will be his death. He knew that, and I put a link to a film, a co-production with the Norwegian and Soviet filmmakers. Very interesting. I think it's from 67, 68, something like that. Old film, black and white, but very, very interesting with Russian subtitle. But this gave me a taste for the Arctic, so he started to plan a trip to the North Pole. This was also unknown area, of course, but there were some indicators that there was a current going from Alaska, from the Bering Strait, and over to Greenland, because they found wreckage from ships and organic material that in Greenland, Spitsbergen, that probably came from the other side. So there was a theory that there was a current, but it was unknown if this current went over the North Pole. They were not sure if it was land under the North Pole. But Fritьоф Nansen's theory was that this current would take him very close to the polar punct, to the North Pole, exactly to the North Pole. And how to get there? Well, before him, expeditions had carried out some research, but these researches were mainly from military people, big ships with a lot of people, 150 people. But Fritьof Nansen planned it another way. He decided to go with a ship manned with 12 men and with supplies for 4 years. When you go for an expedition, or when you went for an expedition in those days, it was not a three months course or a half a year or a year. You had to plan for 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, or a year. So the horizon was very long. He planned this for 2 years, and in 1893, they sailed from Norway, and they took the northernmost route south of Novaya Zemlya, and they went east and started off some islands called New Siberian Islands in English. It's not as far as the Bering Strait, but according to his theory, he could start there and let the ship be frozen in. And that was also a new achievement or a new theory, because the ice is strong. It can break the strongest iron. So every ship would be crushed if they met the ice and was frozen in. But his theory was that you could make a ship with a hull, the bottom of the ship, which was a bit like a ball. So when the ice started to crush the ship would lift. And to make a long history short, this worked according to the plan. So when they met the ice, it elevated, it was lifted up, and it started to drift westwards and with a northern westward course. But time went by, and you can imagine that this is a very, very slow current, a very, very slow journey. So after approximately a year, he understood that this is not going to work for two reasons. The current is too slow. We move too slowly. It will take us from 5 to 7 years to get out on the other side if we go to the North Pole. So after approximately a year and a half, he decided that this will not work. So together with his friend Hjalmar Johansen, he decided to leave the ship with the other 12 men, or the remaining 10 men, and they equipped an expedition with, I think, around 24 dogs and a couple of sledges, and they set off to the North Pole. They had a lot of difficulties, and they had to return twice before they succeeded the third time to get away. And they walked or traveled with these sledges for almost 6 months, I think, about 6 months. And he saw that it was impossible after a while to reach the North Pole. They came to around 94 degrees north, and then he understood this is possible because the ice, the shape of the ice were not flat, but when it had the ice turned against each other, it made some sort of ice that it was impossible to cross, even for the dog. So they had to break off the expedition, and they headed for Spitsbergen or for Franz Josef's land. They were not sure where to end, but after approximately a year, they managed to come to Franz Josef's land. They managed to build shelter to survive. They had eaten all their dogs. They had killed the dogs to feed the other dogs, and they had killed the dogs to survive. But when they came to Franz Josef's land, they were able to survive. But after a year, suddenly they heard noises, and there was an English expedition in the same area. So they got contact with an English explorer, and they managed to get back to Norway. It was a coincidence, but at the same time, the ship Fram, ship was called, also managed to reach Oslo 5 days after Fritьоф Nansen himself reached the area. I could tell you a lot about how they survived, about their preparation, things like that, but this will take a long time. But what is to remember from his achievements is that you have to be a bit crazy to go through the Arctic region, even today. He never reached the North Pole. He never reached the South Pole. This was done by another Norwegian, Amundsen, who was the first one on the South Pole and probably the first who flew over with the Zeppeliner of the North Pole. But the first people who set their foot on the North Pole were some Russians. I'm not sure of their names, but they were the first to land with an aeroplane. And of course, to go with an aeroplane or Zeppeliner or fly across an ocean, which was possible later in this time, it's important, but it's not the same. And if Fridtjof Nansen had not started these expeditions, of course there would have been people after him who would have done more or less the same. So without Fridtjof Nansen, we cannot say that no one would know about the Arctic today, of course. But we can learn from these achievements. And what is also important when we talk about the Arctic or the Antarctica, it has also political implications. Fridtjof Nansen's achievements in the Arctic made him suitable for political life, and he was very important in the process of Norway to free themselves from the union with Sweden. Fridtjof Nansen was a nationalist. He wanted the Norwegian flag to fly over the North Pole, because at the time when he started, we always had to have a Swedish part in our national flag, signaling that we were not a free nation. So this gave him an enormous political power when he came back to Norway. Many wanted him to be the first president of Norway, because at the time there was a question, should Norway be a monarchy or a republic? And many people wanted Nansen to be the president. So to make also this short, it has political implications when you explore new regions. He was a science, what should we call it? Scientific man, and he did his researches when he traveled. He had some achievements in this field as well, and this is important, of course. But exploration and politics and economy goes together, and of course this region is rich in natural resources, and both Norway, Russia, China, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, the United States, they are interested in this region. And so when you young people are concerned with this region, you also have to know that you are in a context of a political and economic sphere. It's very interesting. We all do our small parts, and together there will be a result in the end. As I said, I've been living in the north of Norway for quite some years, and now I live in Larvik, a smaller town in the south of Norway, and in about a kilometer from here, Fridtjof Nansen built his ship by the famous shipbuilder Colin Archer. So I have sort of grown up with his stories and his achievements, and for my generation, Nansen, great heroes, and it was sort of a masculine, what do you call it, idols for us. Before internet, before pop stars, they were our heroes, and this also shaped the nations. In our time, heroes, at least in our part of the world, in Norway, is not that important anymore. Sorry to say. But hopefully this has given you a little insight in the first explorer of the Arctic. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to ask them. So answer them.
Thank you, Jan. You're right that people should be crazy to go to Arctic, but I think crazy in love with Arctic. Есть вопросы?
Okay, I have a question. Firstly, thank you very much for your interesting presentation about very interesting people. And now we are talking about people in Arctic. And of course, Nansen is very interesting people in Arctic. And we have a very interesting fact. Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russian Empire gave Nansen recommendation letter for his expedition. It was very interesting fact because it was a very big discuss about his way, what is was, and my question is, what do you think? Who was Nansen? Hero, very ambitious man, or science? What do you think? Who was really? Yes.
Yeah. He was complex in the way that he was a very good athlete. He trained a lot for his expedition. He was a science because he had his degree at the University in Bergen. He was a great humanitarian. I haven't mentioned this, but the reason why Fritьоф Nansen is at least the 70s and the 80s, 60s, 70s, and 80s were very sort of popular in Soviet Union and later maybe in Russia. Many streets in different cities in Russia is named after him, was because of his humanitarian side, where he sort of rescued millions of what we call it in English, prisoners of war and Biesnitsi in Russia and Ukraine, and he got the Nobel Peace Prize in 1922 for his humanitarian aid. So he was a very complex person, but it's my impression, and at least that's the impression you get when you read about him. He was a great humanitarian. He was honest, he was hardworking, and he did his scientific work for the best of humankind. And he sort of despised politics. He knew that if he was going to be a politician, he would spend a lot of time in his chamber, in his office, in negotiations, things like politicians do. But he was a science man and a humanitarian. So this was what he was sort of burning for. So he was complex.
Thank you.
У нас есть вопрос онлайн.
Thank you, Jan. I'm sure that your report was very useful for everyone, and our team is very grateful that you have decided to take part in our round table at the St. Petersburg University, and in June as part of the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. And in this year, St. Petersburg Economic Forum will be held with the participations of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS. Also, a few years ago, there were many people from Norway and which we have a lot of common interest. How do you consider it important for people from Norway to come to such events in Russia, and the people from Russia to Norway, even in such a difficult situation? Thank you.
Yes, as you mentioned, there are difficult political times now, and I've seen that this Arctic Forum was a bit of backlash when they were to hand the chairman seat from, I think, from Russia to Norway. But I think it's very important, nevertheless, to try to always keep the channels open and as much as possible participate on both sides in every organizations or conferences and cooperations, because this is political decided situation. And the politicians of Norway, they do not often always follow their own instincts, so to speak, and to be a bit careful. They do not always decide for themselves what is best for Norway. So I think on the lower level, among scientists and on both sides, young people, also politicians, business people, it's important to keep every channel as open as possible. And if you come to practical things, I see it is difficult to get visa both ways. It takes a long time or longer time, and travel is a bit complicated, but bus and train is a possible means of transport. So even if there are no flights now between Oslo and Moscow, there are possibilities. And was in Moscow a few 2 months ago, February. So it is possible. So I will encourage everyone who works in this field to continue the work, because politics, they are there for 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, and then the tide changes, and then there is another situation. It seems grim at the moment, but suddenly thing can change. So I think I will answer in this way. Continue the work as far as possible.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. Yeah, we agree with you about necessity to maintain cooperation. And we have another question from Pasak.
Okay. Меня слышно, да?
Да, слышу.
Okay. Okay, so thank you for your wonderful presentation. And it was actually pretty interesting to know about the history of Arctic, especially for people like me who are like new joinees in this domain. So my question to you is a little different. Like already Norway has got the presidency of Arctic Council, as we know. And and of course, as you have already mentioned, that traveling is a bit difficult right now, considering the present situation. But at the same time, like I personally believe that academics and science should be beyond politics, because an Arctic is a region that is at the interest of everyone, not just for Russia, not just for Norway, it's for the interest for all the Arctic countries. So do you think, like, how do you think about the opportunities of participating from Russia in some scientific events or programs, even if it's online? Like, will it be possible in the near future if this present situation continues? Like from Russia, is it possible to participate in some Nordic programs or some scientific events related to Arctic?
I have to sort of speculate, and there was I had suddenly thought in my mind that this all these sanctions that makes things possible. I don't think there are any sanctions against online conferences. So in this way, we could sort of avoid the new sanctions by having online courses, because I'm not sure, but I think that many scientists in Norway, people who are interested in the Arctic, they would like to continue this. And as you have proven now, it is possible to have fruitful discussions also online. You save a lot of time, you save a lot of energy, and you have time to prepare. So I think that this will be possible, but I will also be a bit conscious when you said that this is the benefit of everyone. The context is, as I said, complicated. It's not just about China, Russia, Norway, and those who are interested in doing this in a humanitarian way, like Fritьof Nannsen. But to be a bit blunt, the situation between NATO, China, and Russia makes this also a very important military area. And if you are able to control, or if you are able to travel on the northern routes with ships, we think about science or commerce, but also military ships, you see that this has a great influx on the security situation in the world. So, as we see now, the military interest always cross before everything else. If you have a military reason for doing something, it will be done if it's practically possible. So yes, I think everyone should work together together for keeping the channels open, but we have to bear in mind that there is other interest also here, and there could be different motives for participating in this area. So for me, I think that Russian young people and scientists should first and foremost think for themselves and work for themselves what is good for our situation, for our people, for our scientists. And if other people are interested in participating, they should be welcome. And we should also, and everyone should also participate when invited, or if there is an open door. But it's a region that is critical also in terms of the new green wave, of course, with melting of ice and this situation, what is real and what is unreal, is also important. I'm sure that you have sort of seen the difference between the North Pole and the South Pole when it comes to building up of ice, and this be careful again, focus on the CO2. How important is this? I think that we on the Western side are too heavily influenced by this. It costs a lot of money and a lot of energy, and as I can see it, for instance, Russia and China, they are a bit more sober, a bit more careful, a bit more sound and about this theme. But this is also an aspect, the green environment, the green wave, and this is also used for political purposes, of course. So
Thank you, Jan.
Yeah.
Actually, instead of speculating about scientific cooperation, I offer to move to the next report about science, because actually we have two reports about science.